Welcome to day three of Truth and Reconciliation Week. My name is Wallace Peterson. I joined RBC's Indigenous Development Program as a recent physics grad last year. I've been working remotely from and currently live in Kahnawake, Mohawk territory on the south shore of Tiohtià:ke, also known as Montreal. I'll be introducing today's speaker. Joining us today for the Métis Homelands session is Will Gudan. We are pleased to welcome you to this session.
Thanks very much, Wallace. I really appreciate it. Excited to be here.
Oh yeah, it's definitely.
Yeah, so as Wallace said, my name is Will Goodon, and I am currently the Minister of Housing and Property Management for the Métis government here in Manitoba, the Manitoba Métis Federation. But I have been very active in, especially the last 5 or 6 years, in talking about the importance of nationhood, of the homeland, of Métis identity, and it seems that there's always a struggle to figure out who is Métis. And one of the things that I think is important to talk about is the homeland, because then the homeland gives us a little bit more of a clear concept, because we like looking at pictures, we like looking at graphics to have a good understanding of that. But before I begin, I wanted to again thank the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation for this opportunity. I think we have a long ways to go for reconciliation, and there's not just a one step that will fix that. There's an understanding that needs to, I think, go both ways, but definitely Canadians are taking this much more seriously than they have in the past. And I want to say thank you to all who are doing the hard work, the heavy lifting, obviously Indigenous peoples themselves, but also our allies. And just wanted to acknowledge that. Always, I want to say thank you to our elders and our veterans who have come before us and who have served, so that we can be where we are today and to move forward on that. I'm hoping today to have a conversation. I'm hoping to be able to put a few thoughts out there, some concepts. Not everyone's going to agree, but I think the best way to gain that understanding is to have that honest discussion and even a debate, which is, in my eyes, a positive thing, because as they say, the sharpest sword comes through the hottest fire. So the best ideas come through excellent debate. And I think that's part of what we all should be aspiring to. Again, I want to say thank you to Wallace, thank you to Tessa, thank you to everyone who's on the technical side of things, making this work and making it easier on me. It's much appreciated. So I'm going to start off, I think, a little bit and going back in time and talking about history. Now, a lot of people believe and assert and argue quite vigorously that the term Métis means mixed. And that understanding is, I think, starting to evolve. And it's to the point now where most legal academic scholars agree that the idea of a nation, a Métis nation, is grounded in Western Canada. When we talk, I'm going to talk about the homeland in a little bit, but I think it's important to set the stage and have an understanding of how does a nation like the Métis Nation get created? How does it just happen in one geographic location? Does it happen everywhere? And I think that goes to the idea of the mixed equals Métis, which I disagree with very much. So when the fur trade was going strong in North America, in Canada, or before it was Canada, in what is now Canada, there was obviously folks who paddled up the lakes and the rivers from Montreal, Toronto to get into Western Canada. And there was, obviously Canada is a very large country. So once folks got out here, there were business arrangements that were made. And a lot of those business arrangements included marriage. There were families that were started out here. Now, that being said, there was marriages that happened right across North America between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And there are lots of people who live in Canada who have an ancestor who has Indigenous roots. But I'm going to lay out a little bit of an understanding of why the idea of mixed does not equal Métis. When a nation, when a people is growing, is forming, there are some markers that will separate these people from other people. And one of them obviously is language. So, the Dakota people speak the Dakota language, the Cree people speak Cree, and the Métis nation, their language was Michif. Now it's an endangered language now, and there's not a lot of folks who speak it. My dad used to, but he lost most of it through school and some assimilation that happened back in the day. There was no protection for languages back then. So language is one of those fundamental things that you can point to say, these people are different. And then there's also the understanding from the people who are not in the collective, who are outside, who point to you and say, you are different. So the First Nations people used to call us a word. It means people who own themselves. And the word is Otipemisiwak. So again, we're being recognized as being a separate people, a separate nation. And some of the other markers will include things like clothing. You'll see a lot of Métis folks that wear sashes nowadays more than ever, but that was a part of the clothing, the flower beadwork that a lot of our people wore, and still it's being revived today. And I think that's a fantastic testament to our culture. When we wear the flower beadwork, it definitely separates us out and people know who we are. In fact, so much so that one of the names that we were called was the flower beadwork people. That's how we were known. Another marker for who, for a nation is, for a people is food. The food that we have is, is derived from other places, but it also is very unique and particular. Music is a big one. I'm sure most of people who are on this call have heard of the Red River Jig. Now, the Red River Jig and the Métis fiddle is very, very unique. There are obviously fiddles throughout the world, but the way that it's played is very, very unique to the Métis Nation. And one of the two more things I wanted to talk about as a marker of a people is political action. Now, when there are dangers surrounding you, when there are people pushing to get you out of the way like they did to the Métis Nation. If you are a really well-formed collective, then you will push back. And political action is spotted throughout the history of the Métis Nation. Always we point to one of the first political actions was a battle. And that battle took place we call it the Frog Plain. And I'll get into that a little bit, but the victory at Frog Plain was the first time that our Métis warriors came together, and they struck a decisive blow in the name of commerce, in the name of protecting themselves and their families, being able to make a living by trading pemmican without the colonial powers interfering, which is exactly what was happening. So you have that one there as a battle, and we won that one. The people who wrote the history books obviously were the ones who lost, and they called it the massacre at Seven Oaks. It slowly got changed to the Battle of Seven Oaks, but our people called it the victory at Frog Plain. And there was even a song written about it by one of our great Métis poets, Pierre Falcon, who wrote La Victoire de la Gwenraie, back obviously in 1816, but that again, the music, this self-identification at that time, Cuthbert Grant Jr., who was the leader, they flew the infinity flag, which is it's on this side here, which is very much a symbol of the historic Métis Nation, and he called themselves the new nation, and that idea, that genesis, that beginning, that they knew that they were different from everybody else, really started probably before that, but it came into full bloom after the battle at the Frog Plain. And then obviously there's other political actions that happened throughout the Métis history, including the Guillaume Sayer trial, which was again about free trade. And then of course everyone knows about when the Métis Nation joined Canada in 1869 and 70, we had to push back against Canada and say, no, we're not joining unless you give us these conditions, and then we will join Canada. Obviously, that was promised and then never fulfilled, which we're still working on today. The Battle of Batoche and the Northwest Resistance is another example of political action. And then you'll see the Métis Nation go underground for a long time. People were ashamed. People were beaten up. Rapes, murders, killings happened. So people did not want to be affiliated with what happened in the past. And then you'll find when our young Métis soldiers who went to war in World War II, and they came back, they were treated poorly. They were not given the respect that all the other veterans were given. And but then they took this, they saw what leadership meant, and they began to organize. And that's where you'll see the beginnings of what is now Métis governance, is those Métis veterans who came back from World War II and began organizing on behalf of their communities, on behalf of their people, on behalf of their families. Housing was horrible. They were living on road allowances, no running water, no nothing, just dirt floors and sod roofs, and not even on land that they can call their own, because the land was taken from them. So just these ideas of people, I think, is really important to understand, because when someone from Nova Scotia or Quebec or even Ontario, when they say that they have an ancestor, they feel that they can self-identify now and use that and point to that one ancestor as proof that they're Métis. I'm going to, one of the things you're going to find is I tend to go off on little tangents when I get ideas. One of the important concepts, and I think it's just come into fruition in the last couple of decades, is this idea of self-determination. A few years ago, the United Nations passed what is called the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I had the opportunity, just again, to go off on another little tangent, I had the opportunity to help draft that. Went to a couple of United Nations meetings back in the late 90s, and that was a big highlight for me in my career to do that. But inside the declaration is this concept of self-declaration or of self-determination. And self-determination means that the people get to decide who we are. And the Métis Nation is making that decision even as we speak. And our decision is that we are the people who are considered Riel's people. We are the people who were called the Otipemisiwak. We are the people who were called the flower beadwork people. And all those people are basically in the prairies of Western Canada. And that'll kind of get me into the Homeland idea. Now, when one of the really important concepts for nationhood and peoplehood, but particularly for the Métis Nation, is this idea of kinship connections. There have been some scholars who have written extensively on this idea, and to simplify it is one of the if you are a Métis person from, say, Winnipeg, and you talk to a Métis person from Northern Alberta, like Lac La Biche, or Saskatchewan, like Isle La Crosse, you will likely be related. That's what I mean by kinship connection. So you might be a third cousin or even a fourth cousin, but there is going to be a connection between you and the people that you meet who are also considered to be Métis Nation citizens. And I think that's really important. And those the webs of these connections are extremely strong in the prairies. As I said, I don't know if I explained this before, the homeland that has been passed at the General Assembly for the Métis Nation was basically the Prairie provinces. It goes a little bit into the Northwest Territories. It goes a little bit into British Columbia, in Northern British Columbia. It goes a little bit into Ontario, Northwest Ontario. It goes into the United States as well. Back in the day, there was no straight line border that kept the buffalo or the beaver or anybody else in check inside those borders. And the Métis Nation was one of the military forces with the buffalo hunt and the fur trade. And the communities that were set up were based on commerce, based on free trade, and there was these settlements, but there was a lot of movement as well, a lot of mobility. And in that mobility, for example, through the buffalo hunt, people would be in their communities, and then they would all gather together and they would go out on the plains and hunt buffalo. Pemmican was produced and it was sold to the fur trade companies, and the fur trade was then fed through the pemmican trade. A very important part of Western Canadian history, but extremely important part of the Métis Nation history. I'm going, what I also wanted to say is if there's any questions while I'm talking, feel free to jump in there. I'm not sure how this works. Wallace is probably going to interrupt me if there's questions or not. But I wanted to throw that out there because I sometimes tend to go off on these tangents, and get a little wordy and verbose as I move through. And try not to use big words, and sometimes I use words I don't even know the meaning of. But that is this homeland that is throughout the prairies is, I think, really important to understand, because when you have communities who today will say they're Métis, but they don't have a connection through kinship, through political action, through food, through music, through dance, then they may be a community, and that's fine. And they can be who they are, but they're not a part of the Métis Nation, and that's a huge controversy. Right now, as we speak, there are things happening within the Métis Nation structure that people disagree with that all they need is to have some ancestor, which they can. So what happens in particular in some of the communities in Eastern Ontario and Quebec and other areas in the East is that there will be somebody who thinks they're Métis, calls themselves Métis, and then what they do is they go back in time and find an ancestor. That ancestor, instead of being Algonquin or Cree, they'll change that ancestor to Métis, and then they will then become Métis themselves. So they're Métis, they make the ancestor Métis, and that makes them Métis. So it's a little bit of a circular logic, which is kind of hard to understand, at least for me, of how they can assert that. But that's why the idea of a homeland is so important, is all those things I talked about. If you are a Métis person, as I said, from northern Alberta or southern Manitoba, there's those connections. The dance is the same. The jig that every Métis person, not except for me, I'm not very good at it, but most Métis people learn how to do. The fiddle music, everybody who's Métis, when they hear the fiddle playing, they know that's theirs. It's a touchy thing, because it seems like those of us who are asserting that the Métis is a specific, unique people and not just mixed, it seems like we're being mean by saying, no, you can't be Métis. And it just comes off as being mean, as being exclusive, as pushing people out rather than trying to bring everybody together. But the thing is, a friend of mine asked me this question once, this is a long time ago. We were talking about Métis identity. So if mixed is all you need to be Métis, and you have a family, a couple who got married, one is, let's say one is Mohawk, one is Swedish. Well, their offspring, their children would have a mixed heritage. Does that mean that those kids are Métis? Well, there is no connection to the historic Métis Nation. There's no connection to the Michif language. There's no connection to the Red River Jig. There's no connection to the clothing, food, and music. And why would that child be so disrespectful to their mom and dad that they would say, I don't want to learn the Mohawk culture. I don't care about Swedish culture. I'm going to have a completely different culture. I'm going to go and learn Michif and learn how to play the jig, which is completely foreign to both mom and dad. Why would you be so disrespectful to your actual heritage and try to take on a unique heritage that is not yours? So I always thought that was a really good and simple way of understanding this mixture. So I'm going to stop right now and see if there's any questions, and take a drink of water and see if anybody is confused or disagrees or wants to throw out a couple of ideas. Well, maybe there's some, I would love to have some questions across the country. Now, reconciliation, what we're talking about and why we're talking about here today. Tomorrow is September 30th, and our offices are closed in recognition, in honor of this day that recognizes, the struggles. And the Métis Nation also obviously takes this very seriously. We're asking our staff, our cabinet to use this as an opportunity to educate, to not just take the day off and go shopping, but to remember the importance of why we're doing this, and why we have these shirts that we have, and why we have these symbols that help people understand. It's a place and a time where we can make that first step. And I know there's a lot of people who feel like the steps aren't happening fast enough, and I totally agree with that. But at the same time, you can't take the 100th step until you take the first step. And I think we are, that is happening. So it is going to be a pretty, at some point in the future, we'll look back on how far we've come, but also look forward to how far we need to go. And that's something that I remember all the time. I started working in the Métis government about 25 years ago. And I look back now where we were, and I look to where we are, and it is an incredible journey. And I think that, on this idea of reconciliation, we are only in the first few steps. But it is my hope that Canadians, all Canadians, keep their eyes on the future, on what could be, and make those steps, because it is that last step that it seems so important, but it is the 99 before as well that are as important as that very last step. How are we doing with questions?
It seems we may not have access to the questions, unfortunately.
Okay.
It's going through a Hubilo stream.
Okay, so what are we doing for time here? We got 10, 15 minutes left.
I guess we could continue talking, unless we can get the questions somehow from the AV group.
Okay, well, we'll keep on keeping on.
Yeah.
And so one of the issues that we're currently facing with respect to the homeland is this idea of who's Métis and who's not. I also want to talk about this, and I talked a little bit about it when I described where the homeland is. This idea of provincial, of international borders, whether it's the province of Manitoba, whether it's that border along the United States, very, very much colonially, I don't even know if that's a word. It's a colonizing way of putting these things on a map. The watersheds don't follow those lines. The buffalo didn't follow those lines. The beaver didn't follow those lines. The Métis didn't follow those lines. And what we're stuck with, and it's even within our own governance structures sometimes, that we're only in Manitoba, that we got the relatives on one side of the border on Manitoba and one side of the border in Saskatchewan. They're the same family, they're the same people, they're the same, belong to the Métis Nation. But the way that our governance is structured is that line is cut right down the middle of those families, of those communities. And honestly, this is my own opinion, but I think that that we need to be less following along the lines of the colonists who drew those lines for just economic or political purposes, and have an understanding that we are one Métis Nation, so that there's not 5 separate Métis Nations from Ontario to British Columbia. there's one Métis Nation with different governance structures. Now, I do believe that we need to evolve so that the governance is Métis Nation specific, so that it is not ruled by lines in the sand that are drawn by the colonists, that we draw our own lines, that we decide who we are, that we have this self-determination, that the homeland as it was back in the 1800s and is today is very similar. But that being said, there's also I want to touch base a little bit on the idea of people who have moved from the homeland, whether it's for jobs or school or other opportunities. People have moved from the homeland. That's your right as a Canadian citizen. You can, if you have a job in Toronto, you can move to Toronto. That's not a problem. It doesn't mean you're not Métis if you live in Toronto, because that's outside the homeland. All it means is that you live on somebody else's territory. But you still have the right to be a Métis citizen. You still have the right to participate in the activities. You still have that heritage that flows through your veins. And at the same time, we need to be able to protect those people, because there's Métis citizens who live in Australia. There's Métis citizens who live in Europe, obviously throughout Canada, the United States. But I do honestly believe that we need to build something new that will keep us all together, even if we're living outside of that home. Like that homeland map is a good way to understand who we are. But I think the idea of coming home is also important too. So if you're living and working in Montreal, but you're from the Red River, that will never be taken away from you. And that is one of the things behind what the MMF did with respect to opening our borders. We will take citizenship applications from Métis citizens, no matter where they live. If you live in Australia, you can have a citizenship card that recognizes you as Métis Nation citizen from the Métis government here in Manitoba. And so I think it's really important. There are going to need to be lots of discussions about governance, about programs, about services, and those are happening as we speak. But this idea of being able to come home, and because if you're in Saskatchewan, you can get a Métis card, but if you're in Australia, there's no Métis Nation out there, obviously. Although some people might think that those people who think mixed equals Métis will disagree with me on that. But we need to make sure that our doors are open to the people who are us. And if you aren't us, again, there's no hard feelings. I think that if there are communities in Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes that have a unique culture that can prove Section 35 rights that are in the Constitution, then I think you should be who you are. And I would support that 100%. And even to have rights that are Aboriginal rights in the Constitution, I think that's not a problem for me whatsoever. What is the issue is if you call yourself Métis and you're not, that opens up a big can of worms. And I think that it lowers, or it hurts who the Métis Nation is, because then we aren't allowed to self-determine. We aren't allowed to say who we are. You're forcing us to you're telling us who you are, and you're telling us that you're us, but you're not. And I think that's a very there are some knee-jerk reactions with that because that becomes a little hurtful. And I think people need to consider that. Again, like I said, you can be who you are, and I will support that. And I know our leadership here will support that as well. But so please go and figure out who you are. Fight for those rights. We had to go to the Supreme Court several times. We had to go to the courts for harvesting rights, for land rights, and it looks like we're going to have to do something for identity rights as well. But that is one of the things I wanted to talk about. How are we doing here, Wallace?
Oh, yeah, pretty well. We have two questions. This one question. So, how does the Métis Homeland connect or overlap with the territories of First Nations and the Prairie provinces? How do or would issues of hunting, fishing rights, etc., get worked out?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And honestly, you sometimes you see these maps on Facebook or whatever that show all the territories of the different Indigenous peoples, whether it's the Dene, the Dakota, Cree people throughout North America. But they weren't hard lines either. There were pretty soft lines, and people moved back and forth. There was, they were a little bit fluid, and I think that is similar to what we have today. That there is a sharing of the land. Back in the 1800s, when the military force of the Métis was at its highest, we had allies. We had allies with the Ojibwe. We had allies with the Cree. We were enemies with other Indigenous peoples on the prairies because you bump into each other on the buffalo hunts and you're fighting over the resources. But so I think that idea of sharing the land, of forming partnerships, I think is really important. And I want to congratulate our leadership here in Manitoba for that forward thinking. We have had several conversations about having our own treaties with First Nations communities to have an understanding, if there is a small number of moose that can only be harvested, then we should be sharing. We shouldn't be making the moose pay for the poor judgment of the people who are hunting. And so I think that is an excellent example, but I think it's a shared land concept. And I think we do have to have those relationships with our cousins who are also on the land and are also asserting themselves and their sovereignty. So I think that's an excellent question. I don't know if there's anything cut and dry other than the fact that we have those alliances still live on, and new alliances are being built as we speak as well. There are some in leadership on both sides who get their backs up against the wall, but for the most part, if you go into one of our communities, you go to a party, there's you won't know who's Métis and who's First Nations and who's not, and it's just everybody's having a good time working together and playing together and having fun together. So I think hopefully that helps a little bit.
Okay, cool. We have a last question here. Can you speak more about the Métis language?
Yeah. So Michif is the language. In fact, Michif is a word that we call ourselves too. It's similar to, so I know it seems a little weird that the Métis have so many names, from Otipemisiwak. Bois Brûlé is a French word for burnt wood people, the flower beadwork people. But Michif is a word that can be used to describe the language, but also used to describe the people. It is a language that is unique in the world, from my understanding. Linguist scholars have come from Japan, from Denmark to come and study this language because of the way it was built. It is somewhat of a mixture of a few different languages, including French, Cree, Ojibwe. It could be in some areas some Gaelic in there as well, from Scotland, in Ireland. But the way that it's put together is unique. That there's the nouns and the action, the verbs. The way it's put together is unique in the fact that the action words are mostly come from the Indigenous side, whereas the words to describe things come from the European side. But it's a very unique language. It is in danger right now. We actually just had appointed to the Indigenous Language Commission someone from our office, a friend of mine, who is going to, her dad was a fluent Michif speaker, and she's going to be working hard to elevate our language so that it becomes something that we can pass on, that we won't lose, but it is very, very close to being gone. Like I said, my dad used to speak the language. My uncle spoke it very well. My dad only remembers a few words, and he teaches me a few words every time we go out hunting. What is, a fox or a skunk or a duck? Or rabbit, those kinds of things in it. And so I know a few smattering words, but I unfortunately am not. But there was also one other language called Bungie, and it is extinct. Now, it was more of a mixture of Gaelic and Ojibwe. It's gone. I think it's been gone for over 100 years, but Michif is the language. But there are different dialects too, and it depends on where that community is. If it's in northern Saskatchewan, it might be a little bit more related to the Dene or the Cree. In the southern Manitoba, it might have a little bit more French influence, but there is a decidedly specific and unique language.
Okay, we have okay, it seems we have time for more questions. We have about 15 minutes left. So here's a question up here. If a person is not Métis, but of a mixed heritage, what would they call themselves? Example, Mohawk and Swedish.
Right. Well, I would think that would be up to the family and the individual. To honor your mom and your dad or your grandma and grandpa, I think is really important. Now, it also would depend, I would think, on where you live. So if that family lived in Mohawk territory, there's likely more chance that they will be raised in that culture. If they moved to Toronto, then be a little bit less. So I think I think it depends on the individual, to be quite honest. If it was me, I would say my dad is, and say his name, my mom is, and our family is part Mohawk and part Swedish. And then that describes you, right? That tells you who you are. And I live in Canada. I am Canadian. So I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah. So the word Métis is a little bit problematic because it means several different things. And obviously back, 200-300 years ago, it meant mixed. But as we all know, language evolves, words evolve. The words that people used in medieval England are not the same words that they use today in downtown London. Those words evolve, the meanings and understandings of words change. And as far as I'm concerned, the word Métis has evolved to the point where it describes a specific nation of people, and that's the Métis Nation.
Okay, it seems there is a mix-up and we're out of time now. So
Okay.
thank you, Will, for all
No problem. That was awesome.
Yeah, that was really I definitely learned a lot myself too, being living on the around the Quebec area. I'm not too familiar with the Prairie provinces or
Yeah.
so definitely it was
Well, thank you,
good
Wallace. I
session.
really appreciate it. It was a wonderful time. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to everyone involved in making this happen. And I would be available to do this in the future as well. I really enjoyed myself. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you all for coming to the session. Just a reminder to all our educators, Reconciliation and Me, a special broadcast by APTN will be airing on APTN at 11 a.m. Central Time, Eastern Mountain Time. Tune into our national broadcast titled National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and which will be streamed live on APTN, CBC, CBC Gem, EC Tele, and EC2.tv at 8 p.m. local time, 9 p.m. Atlantic, and 9:30 p.m. Newfoundland time, followed by a special program produced by CBC Manitoba. Wear an orange shirt, display your orange on your home, and light Turtle Island orange. We hope that you enjoy the rest of the week and see you tomorrow. On